Kafka Training Academy's winter series. We hope that you've had a chance to attend and participate in the first 3 sessions. We hope you enjoy this session as well. This session is going to be focused on the actual concept of monitoring subrecipients, subgrantees, and that work that's really associated with that work. Oh my gosh, I said that twice. Anyway, just to kick us off, we have Katrina, as Gretchen is filling in for Claire Frabel. For those of you who said, hey, that's not Claire, the language that was on the announcement, that's Gretchen. Yes, it is. We, of course, are nimble and we're constantly shifting and filling in for each other. So Gretchen will be here filling in. And so we're going to get started. If you have any questions, by the way, please type them into the chat box or raise your hand or anything else, and we'll try to get to them. We have a couple of questions that I'll be covering and the panel will answer, and then we'll take questions at the end. We have an hour set aside for these discussions, and we hope that you enjoyed this session as much as you have enjoyed the other 3. So why don't we get started with introductions and the roles that each of you play at your various agencies. So why don't we start with Katrina? So if you can tell, because everyone may not know who Katrina is. I'm like, everyone knows who Katrina is, but you know how that goes. So Katrina, could you start off with telling us who you are and your role at CAFCA, and then Gretchen, who you are and your role at DSS?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katrina Bresnahan. I am the SSBG Case Management Project Director at CAFCA. So I direct the SSBG program, and I also help with, again, our other contracts. So I'm aware of SNAP Outreach and, the other initiatives at CAFCA as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yelmini. I am a program assistant specialist at the Department of Social Services. I monitor Ssvg, SSBG, special projects, LIHEAP. I have done it all. I used to do way back in the day weatherization. So I have a long and storied history at the department and an OCS monitoring different programs.
So thank you both. And so what I'd like to ask you both, if you could please describe the importance that you believe of monitoring subgrantees. Gretchen, why don't we start with you, and then Katrina.
Sure. Well, monitoring of subgrantees is important, number one, because it's a required activity of the funder. So we are required by contract, either through HHS or our own state guidelines, to monitor subgrantees every year, or in terms of the triennial, every 3 years. So we have stated requirements of monitoring. I know that may look a little bit different in the pandemic, but we are required to monitor. It addresses multiple levels of program effectiveness. And by that, I mean that it identifies areas of progress and success, identifies areas of compliance findings for correction, identifies areas of risk to address before those risks become a compliance finding and you have to hear from us and do different things, identifies topics for training and technical assistance, and monitoring also will take a lot of different forms. It will take the form of TNTA sessions, which are either virtual by phone or a Zoom or in person when that allows in 2022, or in the before times, as I like to jokingly call it. It will also involve corrective action and quality improvement plans, and also just monitoring letters. We do try to highlight some successes of the agency as well. And one of the things that I think that monitoring gets us is a personal touch with the agencies. We get to understand you all a little bit better through the process of monitoring, just what you guys do. And so when we're asked from a state perspective to sing the praises of the CAP network, we do that mostly because of our involvement with your agencies through monitoring. Katrina?
Yep. So actually, a lot of what I wrote is similar to what Gretchen said, and that the first point that I wanted to make sure was that I made was that we monitor because it's a contractual requirement. So in our, in our SSBG contract, it's a requirement that we monitor agencies yearly. And a lot of the language that you actually see in your scope of work and your agency subcontracts is directly from Kafka's contract language. So again, if we don't make sure the agencies are compliant, we're not compliant in our contract either. Also, again, I really like to point out that monitoring isn't a gotcha. So you'll hear me say that a couple times, but we're not here to, I'm not looking at monitoring in hopes of catching you being non-compliant. We really use what we find if there is non-compliance, again, to really help decide what our focuses are going to be when it comes to training and technical assistance for each agency. So again, if we see that an agency is struggling in a certain area, it allows me to then offer additional guidance and training to that agency. And the last thing I just wanted to mention as well when it comes to the importance of monitoring is also a lot of times I feel like when we're talking about monitoring, because CAFCA we monitor yearly, and part of that, and the main part of that for a lot of agencies that they focus on is the file review. But in actuality, we're monitoring, every month when you send me your monthly report, I consider that monitoring. We're monitoring client progress. We're monitoring, your achievement in your targets that are listed in your subcontract, also in your understanding of the outcome measures that we report on in SSBG as well. So, we're doing consistent monitoring of agencies and then using that to then advocate for best practices within the network. We do, yearly fiscal monitoring of agencies as well. So when you think of monitoring, we shouldn't just think of file review. There's more to it that we're actively monitoring. And you'll see that that's usually featured in yearly monitoring reports as well and your corrective action plans.
So Katrina, part of what you said leads me into my next question. This one's really for Gretchen. So Gretchen, how important is actual contract language to the successful service delivery? How important is the actual words in that contract?
So Katrina already started that conversation, as you mentioned. The contract is basically the foundation of what we've negotiated to, for lack of a better term, buy. And it's critical to successful service delivery. In its development and the negotiation process, we meaning the department, strive to ensure that the language is clear, compliant with funding requirements, inclusive of all allowable services and service delivery parameters. And that the community action agencies, when you guys are developing that through your planners and through the other staff that are involved in that process, they develop their programs and service delivery methods, and they need to adhere to that contract language to ensure compliance and positive impacts for the customers and the low-income residents of Connecticut. We recommend that all pertinent staff have access to their contracts, that you take time to review those and learn what the contract language means in plain terms and understand the language as it applies to your daily work. So I think that a lot of, especially frontline staff, are the ones who are implementing those contracts, but they don't necessarily read those contracts. And I get it, it's a lot of pages, but at least the scope of services and kind of the targets should be things that the frontline workers are aware of, because that's what we are monitoring against when we monitor. There's certain other things that we monitor against too, especially in the Ssvg program, just because we have the organizational standards, the triennial. However, it all comes back to the contract, because the contract is kind of the guiding document as part of that process. So contracts and clear negotiation and clear deliverables are very important, not only for us to measure performance, but for you just to understand kind of your role in implementing that document in that contract.
Perfect. So Katrina, just to move off of what Gretchen was talking about, the SSBG program manager meetings is one of those deliverables for CAFCA and the DSS contract. So can you describe the purpose from your perspective of the SSBG program manager meetings, and also how does it support CAFCA's monitoring responsibilities?
Okay, sure. So first I should say that, we have regular program managers meetings. We have them every other month right now. At the beginning of the program, when we were really trying to implement and have agencies understand, what SSBG case management was back in 2016. Now it's been 5 years. We had monthly meetings again, and we also have agencies hold, our meetings are the second Tuesday of a month. We have agencies hold that time slot just in case we have to have additional meetings, because we really see the meetings as that's the place where I'm able to then convey the information that I've found, again, in monitoring reports, doing file review monitoring and all of that, and really convey any issues that we've found or best practices related to that to our program management. So we have regular conversations about, at every meeting we have on the agenda discussing reporting. So then again, if I've seen any issue, because one of the things that I've learned in the last 5 years is that if I see something at one agency, it might be happening at another agency. So, it's best to kind of make everyone aware of that at the same time and offer guidance on that. And then also allow for discussion, because again, we have a great group of program managers. So they're able to share as well versus me just sending emails. Also, we have time for, again, as most of you are aware, SSBG also has, as part of our program, we have our own housing support fund. So at every meeting, again, we have time to discuss best practices or issues that we've found in relation to housing applications, because those are directly tied to client files. So even though we're not doing we're doing yearly file review, I have a more, I actually have a monthly view of how files might look based on what's needed to be included in a housing fund application. So, I'm seeing client service plans year round because those are a requirement of the housing fund. So again, it gives me another opportunity to just bring up any issues we may see. Also, again, even in the last year with COVID, we've developed time in our program managers meetings for our agencies to discuss best practices and what they've been doing, in the new normal at their agencies. So it really is a time to allow, I wrote here, to allow peer-to-peer brainstorming and discussion, and for us to immediately, if we see any issues in compliance, to make sure that the network is aware of that.
Great, thank you. So my next question is really for the both of you, and we'll start off with Gretchen and then move to Katrina. And can you identify 3 of the most common issues or concerns that you've identified during your monitoring reviews? So it's 2 kind of different perspectives, but I'd like to hear from both of you about those kinds of items.
Sure. So the first one would probably be lack of documentation of client eligibility for the funded program. That requires income documentation if it's necessary, or a zero income affidavit, or something along those lines. And also the use of the case notes when necessary for that as well. We really do expect that the clients who are receiving funding for a service are eligible to receive that service. So HSI doesn't have an income limit. However, a lot of the other programs that the agencies do implement and administer do have income limits, so we expect to see those there as well. Failure to achieve the targets, both in terms of the numbers of clients served and the percentages of the outcomes achieved. This goes into your data system. You should be able to track that in the system and also be able to report on that as well through those quarterly reports that you send us, any programmatic reports. But make sure when you're doing your targeting that you target appropriately and don't just say, oh, we're going to serve everyone, because when you say that you're going to serve everyone, we understand there's really good intentions there. However, what can you really do if you try to serve everyone? You're not able to provide that quality service that we're asking for by having to serve everybody. You're rushing everybody in and out the door in like 5 to 10 minute increments. So we really promote that holistic service delivery model. That's the HSI program, but not program, but like the HSI model. And so we expect that to kind of play into what you do for targeting. And finally, one of the other things that we noticed just from the DSS side is that expenditures are charged to the program without documentation to confirm how those costs are eligible to be charged to the program. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're charging things. Make sure that you're allowed to charge those things. Those things are directly tracing back to the program that you're charging. So I think that those are the top three for us. So I'll just turn it over to Katrina.
Okay, and I'm going to touch on some things that Gretchen said as well, because obviously I know that when we monitor, you know, Claire is my my program manager, so we compare notes as well often. So I know that we find the same things. But there were a couple of things that I really wanted to reiterate here. And one of them was kind of what Gretchen touched on first. So a huge thing that we've seen in SSBG case management over the years is there's no clear reasoning in the files of the determined SSBG eligibility. So, and what I mean by that is there's, you know, SSBG does have an income requirement to be included in the program, but SSBG is case management for vulnerable or at-risk adults, and they have to be determined as part of that target population. So just because someone is income eligible, so they might be, again, our income eligibility for SSBG case management is 150% of the federal poverty level. That doesn't automatically mean that they are eligible for SSBG services. That case manager really has to show us why that person has been deemed vulnerable or at risk. And we have a very clear definition of target population that is included in the SSBG desk guide, every training that I do. Again, this is my soapbox. So, you know, so it's something that, again, you know, I need to see some, usually in case notes, I need to see some explanation of why that person has been, you know, at intake deemed a vulnerable at-risk adult that needs SSBG services. Because again, the inherent case management that we're offering as an SSBG is no different than the other case management that we should be offering in our network. The difference here is, again, SSBG, case management for vulnerable at-risk adults. So that's the first thing I wanted to just mention. The second thing is income verification oftentimes is not either appropriate or correct. So just some things that by what I mean on that is, you know, sometimes income verification in the file, you know, it's correct. It's, you know, recent pay stubs, everything seems correct, but then somehow it gets entered into the system incorrectly. We've also seen cases where, you know, things like federal poverty level might not have been updated in the system yet. So they're using old data. So again, there might be inconsistencies in if someone actually is eligible. Also, again, not counting the correct family size. So someone that might actually only be a family of one is being, you know, assessed as a family of three, and therefore they're showing as program eligible when they're not. So it's just little things like that. Also, a new one that I've seen a lot, and so I just want to mention it, is pay stubs that come through apps that don't have a client's name on them. So again, I'll see a printout in the file where a client provided their pay stubs, but it's really just kind of a picture in an app that has there's nothing there that ties it to the client itself. So little things like that, where we just always have to make sure that documentation, you know, documentation is the most important part of contract compliance, I feel like. So making sure that it's appropriate documentation. And then the last one, well, I wrote more than 4, let me see. The last one that I'll discuss though is that one thing that we've seen in the past with SSBG is that SSBG staff are being used only to staff other agency programs. And what I mean by that, for example, is obviously, you know, we want to be holistic case management. So we love that staff are cross-trained. But if someone is coming in and only getting energy assistance or utilities assistance from an SSBG case manager and no other services, is that an appropriate SSBG customer? So I'll leave it there. I have other ones listed, but.
So Katrina, and I'm going to switch on my other hat very, very quickly, and then I'll move back to the questions. You hit at something that, you know, is something that the network is struggling with, and it's really around time and effort. So tied to that piece of it, what are you supposedly contracted to do? And when you're looking at the time and effort reports, are they doing that contracted work? And how is it being demonstrated and documented? The other part that Gretchen touched on, but it's very, very important around the HSI concept. HSI is 2 funding streams, federal and state. Does your time and effort documentation support that? Does your documentation support that level of work? And it's getting at those key points, which are considered a death of 1,000 paper cuts, tied to what Gretchen and Katrina were talking about. So those common issues can really be resolved when you think about what are they buying, and can I demonstrate that I've provided that kind of activity through time and effort. And what we're seeing is that a lot of times it isn't going on, or what we're really finding out is that people are doing what they're not supposed to be doing. So again, let's figure out a better practice of what we're doing. So I'll just move back to my role as interviewer now, but I had to just go there because Katrina gave me the door, and I'm like, okay, I'll go. So Gretchen, we've slightly discussed the topic of documentation a bit. I went too far, but anyway. And then about policies and procedures and internal tools. So, how important are these concepts for contract compliance?
Well, I think we've kind of all hit on it. It's one of the most important things that you do because we monitor your documentation. That if you do not document, it does not exist. That means, especially now, proper use of your electronic systems, because we're virtually monitoring you guys, so for the most part, because of the pandemic. So if it's not in the system and it does not exist, it is not in your quarterly reports, it is not in your annual reports, and so it's like you didn't do anything at all. We know that you guys do a ton of work. It's very valuable work, but documenting that work is the only way that anybody's going to acknowledge that you did it. It's sort of like that. If a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. I will tell you, if I serve a client and bring them out of poverty and I don't document it, is that person really out of poverty? Yes, they're out of poverty, but you didn't get any credit for it. So I think that that's just something to keep in mind. We want to have a strong network. We believe that we do have a strong network, but our network, for the purposes of anybody looking in on our network who doesn't know it as well as we do, our network is only as strong as our documentation. Your agency is only as strong as your documentation. So those are very, very important things. It's documenting your client records, it's documenting your system records. It's for the purpose of the triennial, you also need to have good HR and fiscal records, your board minutes, ideally not like 300-page board minutes that we have to sit through. We know that some boards like that process, but just something that's easily accessible to somebody who's just new to your agency, if possible, is really what we would recommend, because when you're developing and documenting, you want to think about, like, if HHS came in tomorrow, would they be able to understand what our agency is about and that we use those funds appropriately? I would say for some agencies, yes. Some agencies are still getting there. So just keep that mindset in mind. That's usually what we do when we go out, is if it makes sense to us, we'll work with you, but we really want it to be like, if HHS came in unannounced tomorrow, would they be able to see that you are doing what is required of the contract and the grant? And then policies and procedures, they are also crucial. They are in your contract. They are a requirement of your contract, actually, in the most part. You may not think so, but usually somewhere embedded in your contract is that you will adhere to your agency's policies and procedures. We monitor you against those policies and procedures. So if you do not have them, again, they don't really exist. Those policies and procedures need to, they're kind of like a roadmap for everything that you do. And they should also follow that same sort of mindset. If a staff person is new to the agency, typically they're new to community action. They're, especially frontline workers, this may be the first job that they've had where they're doing this level of work. So when you develop those policies and procedures, you want to keep that audience in mind. So somebody new to the agency, if they read that document, would they understand what they're required to do, what the intent of their work is? So really think about that as you're writing or editing those documents, is to really think about the end user of that document. And while it may be everyone, policies and procedures really are meant for the program managers and the frontline staff. So you want to develop those policies and procedures with that audience in mind. And we're happy to work with you to, if you want to bounce off ideas with us. We've done that for several agencies. We're always willing to have that conversation, but really that's sort of like how you should develop that. And that should also document things like the income eligibility, how to use the system, how to move a client through the agency, what your HSI model looks like, what each program requires, and what that might be, what little shift on case management, because I think Katrina said it earlier, case management is case management is case management. It's just that there are certain little like tweaks to it that apply to different funding streams. So just how those tweaks work with just keeping the idea that case management is one bubble with slight nuance, as well as there's also internal tools that that are used for documentation, such as how to use the Housing Resources Fund, the flexible funding for COVID, documenting the PARs for SNAP outreach and so on. So those are all crucial things that are very important because, again, documentation is king and queen and emperor and so on. I could go on for days about all the different titles, but without documentation, it's like you didn't do anything at all. So it's very important.
Great. So this interview is just flowing into from one concept to the other. And so Katrina, with that, we've talked about the importance of documentation, monitoring the roles, lessons learned, all of these kinds of things. And so what I'd like you to do is to describe a couple of the best practices that you've identified during your monitoring work of subgrantees.
Okay. So I want to start with one that actually kind of ties into what Gretchen just said. And also before I go there, I just want to say as well, for SSBG, we defer back to your case management policies and procedures as well. So I'll get direct, questions a lot like, well, how often do we have to do follow-up, for example? Well, we always defer back to your agency case management policies and procedures manual. And over the years, there's been multiple times where I've heard, when I've asked that, well, what does your policies and procedures manual say? And direct service staff will say, I don't know. So again, it's really, what Gretchen said is really important. Again, your case management policies and procedures manual, that's really where, frontline staff should be getting the guidance for the case management services that you're offering. Anyway, so one of the things that I wanted to focus on though was talking about how we've evolved in moving towards goal-oriented service plan development. That's really one of the areas where I felt like, and it ties into documentation as well. Again, with SSBG, we started doing, we started talking or doing monitoring in 2000. I think we started it the first year in 2016. And one of the things that we noticed was that there was a lack of clarity or a lack of consistency in the use of service plans at agencies. So one of the things that we've really stressed with SSBG over the years is moving towards, a goal-oriented service plan that doesn't include things like services as the goal, doesn't include, action steps without tying it again to services that you're actually providing. There was a lot of inconsistency between case notes and service plans and what was entered into the system. So I feel like one of the areas we really excelled with SSBG is getting people to move towards that. We don't use there's not a required service plan that the network has to use. We do have a suggested one that we actually took from an agency that we liked their paper service plan. So that's one that we have sent out to the network, but just moving towards that. And what that has helped with is making sure that all services are recorded, because again, one of the consistent issues has been, we'll see things listed in case notes that don't tie to what's in the system, right? Or again, what's on a service plan, or service plans that are incomplete or not filled out. So I feel like one of the areas that we've really been able to advocate for best practices throughout the years is, again, service plan development and moving towards a goal-oriented service plan at agencies. That we're again, because that's really one of those areas where we saw different levels of compliance with that at the beginning of the program. One of the other things I also wanted to mention here, just because it's something that, again, some agencies might not realize really came out of monitoring, but the Housing Support Fund in and of itself really came from monitoring. So what I mean by that is, again, one of the consistent issues that we saw in the first year of the program was that agencies were struggling with helping people obtain or maintain stable housing. And that is one of the reporting outcomes that we report on with SSBG. So in monitoring reporting, and also when going into agencies and seeing that that was a consistent struggle, when doing file review, that's really where the Housing Fund was born. We were able to use that information and petition DSS to create this fund where, this week we kind of talked about how there's a lot of funding now suddenly for housing, but in 2017 there was not, funding for that was easier to access versus going through the coordinated access network. So I feel like that's one of the things that has really come out of our monitoring, and it was a direct result of, again, feedback from the network and also what we saw when we would do our file reviews and report monitoring and compiling.
So thank you, Katrina. And I think that just that last thought that you're leaving the attendees with is, from monitoring, you were able to take that information, identify a need and a barrier, and be able to approach the department to reprogram resources to be able to address a need. So if people have heard nothing else, that's one of those great things about looking at what the need is, what barriers are, and really operationalizing that cycle and then deploying something else. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is that that fund is needed. As Katrina said, right now, because of everything else that's coming down, it may not be maxed out as quickly, but there are still people that this fund still works for. So I think that is a great concept idea. And it leads me to my final question, which I'm going to direct to Gretchen. And it's really around the actual contract and agreements that some community action agencies might be entering into with CARES dollars or other resources. The department has done some monitoring of CAA subcontract agreements. It's required in our contracts with agencies that if indeed they enter into subcontracts with organizations, entities for services, they have to do A, B, and C. But what we've identified is that some of those agreements aren't really identifying what's being purchased, clearly defining what that expectation is, or even related to how reimbursement is going to happen. So could you please identify, just a couple of really key elements that should be in a CAA subcontract agreement for services?
Sure. So I think before we get into that, I think it's just want to clarify to everybody on this call that a subcontract agreement is still beholden to the language of the contract. So by virtue of being called a subcontract, they are performing deliverables on behalf of you and on behalf of performance of that contract. So I think that that is a good framework just to think about before we dive into specific issues, because I think that when people maybe aren't as versed in the contracting process, or they've just done contracting for years where we go back and forth about a template, they've now gotten these new dollars and they're trying to, expand their reach, which we understand and we can appreciate. But again, a subcontract is a subset of the contract. So like they're acting on your behalf for the performance of, for Cassie's example, CARES, CSBG CARES. So everything that they do on behalf of you, that they've contracted with for you, has to flow up into that CARES contract. Or for a more common example, the CSBG or the SSBG case management contract. DSS contracted with Kafka and then made all 9 community action agencies subcontractors of Kafka. So that contract that Kafka has with you all is to perform SSBG services on behalf of Kafka for the performance of that contract. So with that framework, I can get into some specifics. I just wanted to really lay that out because I think that gets a little bit lost as we talk about subcontractors, because people just focus on that word, when really just think about it like a pyramid where the contract is, I don't know if you guys want to do a funnel down or a top up, but ultimately the contract is here, the meaning the funder is here, then the contractors here, the subcontractors down here, so it all flows up. And just so you know, we are technically contractors of HHS, so what you guys are our subs too. So there's multiple layers to this as well. Everybody's got a boss, right? So anyway, some of the specific things that we noticed are that the DSS contract language includes several sections within it about the requirements for subcontractors. I sort of hit on that with the funnel approach, but we would recommend, as you develop a subcontractor agreement, looking first at your contract to see what those requirements are. And for example, there's a section that says, in part, no federally appropriated funds have been paid or shall be paid by or on behalf of the state to any person for influencing or attempting to influence any officer or employees of any agency, member of Congress, an officer, employee of, or an employee or member of Congress, or an employee or member of Congress in connection with awarding of any federal loan, the entrance into any cooperative agreement, et cetera, et cetera. So basically what that means is, in layman's terms, we do not pay with federal dollars for lobbying and those sorts of things. So that's just an example. Not to say that you guys are doing that, but just making sure as you go through that contract, that these dollars will use for lobbying either your state reps, your state senators, or your federal members of Congress, and that your subcontractors aren't accidentally doing that the same. Sometimes that means your dues to David Bradley's organization cannot be paid for with our dollars, because that's still lobbying. You're paying a lobbyist. So just being aware of those sorts of things. So I'm just trying to think of practical examples where that might come up. As we kind of already hinted on, contractors, again, are responsible for the performance of any subcontractor. So you should be monitoring what they're doing with your dollars. That's what Katrina does as a CAFCA staff person. She makes sure that you guys are adhering to those dollars. That is because that is a requirement of anybody who engages with subcontractors. So if you decide to go the subcontractor route, you are now responsible for them. You basically adopted them as your contracting children. So everything they do is now your responsibility. So they have got to adhere to the contract, which is the best way to do that is by putting it all in the subcontractor agreement. Subcontractors, again, must be pre-approved by the department. So they are usually part of the contract negotiation process. So if you were to add subcontractors, you would have to amend the contract and negotiate with us, because there is a section in your contracts for subcontractors. That's so that way everybody's on the same page and we're not just surprised at the end that there's a subcontractor. And so again, there's certain provisions of that in Part 1, Section J, 4B. And so those are sort of about what you have to do there. If you want to add a subcontractor, the best thing to do is talk to your program liaison instead of going into the specifics here. But Claire and I will talk to you about that. And we can loop Cassie in as necessary. But just I think the big thing is just that you cannot engage with a subcontractor with any of the state contracts without first talking to whoever your program rep is. I mean, we're all OCS or contractors of OCS on this call, but this goes true for any other state contracts that you might have with another agency. You have got to talk to whoever your contact is first before you add a subcontractor. Subcontractors are included in the quality assurance activities of the department. Contractors are required to monitor your subcontractors and report any compliance findings and so on to the department as they occur. And failure to do that will involve a discussion with us, because ultimately you are responsible to us. The subcontractor is not responsible to us. So anything that they do or they don't do with your dollars reflects on you. And so we will engage with you. We will not necessarily engage with your subcontractor unless it's required and we're asked to do so. But we would engage first with you because we are contracted to with you for the performance of those services. So in just short, my subcontractor didn't do that is not an excuse. You are responsible for your subcontractors. So I hope that clears up things.
Well, Gretchen, I really think it does really pull everything together. So we are under the 1245 wire, 1243, so woo! And so we have about 17 minutes for questions and discussions on this topic. I hope that it was valuable again, because this could be a death of 1,000 paper cuts. You're actually reaching out or partnering with or asking some entity, entering into agreement with an entity to provide a service. The first question is that what is that service that you're buying, and is it allowable? And how does it align with the actual contract deliverables? Are they doing work for you that's actually going to roll up as a service, as an SRV? What is their documentation? Because again, if they don't document the provision of services, how are you going to be able to demonstrate the work was actually done? Also, when you're looking at that tied to reimbursement, are they going to invoice you? And if they're going to invoice you, what is that backup documentation to show the delivery of the service? Also tied to, let's say you make a payment late to a vendor or something else, and they have language that if indeed you're late and you pay after 60 days, there are fees associated with it. They're not fees that the contract is going to pick up. There's going to be other fees, and you're going to have to find other resources. So it's like the death of 1,000 paper cuts, and understanding the various nuances of what are you buying? How are you going to be able to demonstrate that you've received that service? Also, were you satisfied with it? Because it's okay to say to a subcontractor, I'm not satisfied with that and I'm not paying for it. Or you might say, you're going to have to do this again. Just think about that, and don't give away your power in the negotiation of those kinds of services. And who's responsible in your, that's another thing. Who's responsible in your agency to herd that subcontractor cat? Is it you or is it somebody else? And if it's somebody else, how do you have that conversation with them about how it's impacting you? Right now with the SSBG overall block grant, I have to enter into agreements with 4 state agencies. And the thing they like to tell me over and over again is that you're not the boss of me, and I'm not doing that. And I have to remind them, unfortunately, for this pot of money, I am. You know, we're equal on a lot of things, but in this instance, this could be a disallowed cost for DSS because DSS is on the hook, and we're not having that. So about that kind of relationship, those kinds of conversations, and they're hard sometimes, and I get it, but it's about coming together to find out, how do we protect each other? Because if you have a disallowed cost, then I'm going to have a disallowed cost. And having everybody be in the pool together, moving in the same direction and using common terms, it's really going to be helpful. And that's the other part that I think I might have missed here, is that when you're dealing with subcontractors, are you using common terms? Is an intervention a service? Because some people want to count interventions as services. Our service could be a one-touch, but under HSI, we're not paying for one touch. We're paying for 2 or more barriers, holistic, comprehensive case management. So what does that work look like? For tied to also the work that SSBG case management's looking for, as Katrina talked about, when you're talking about that target population and people are like, oh, they're 150% of the federal poverty level. But are they vulnerable as we've defined? And let's have that conversation. That's yet something else that I think we spent like 2 years in the beginning parts of just digging in and having that conversation and saying, this is safe space. Let's have this conversation. And then we had to move from, all right, now it's been 2 years. We no longer can have safe space because we're not moving the needle. Now we actually have to monitor. We have to move that needle and have that level of conversation, and then identify if indeed there are issues or concerns. How do we provide training to make sure, again, we can move that needle? And that's why I had asked the panel to talk about some of the common errors that exist, or issues or barriers, because again, providing training to address those, and then accepting the fact or acknowledging the fact that maybe sometimes this grant isn't right for you, and sometimes you have to give it back. There have been agencies, CAAs, for other funding sources, not directly DSS's, but they've actually given the funding back because it is either too burdensome or they don't have the ability to do that work and they would prefer to voluntarily give that grant back than have it actually taken from them. Because when you respond to a procurement, one of the questions that people ask, do you have any monitoring findings? Did someone remove a grant from you? And so sometimes it's better to give it back than have to report, yes, I've had someone defund me because of monitoring findings or whatever it is. So those are things that people should be thinking about from a monitoring standpoint, separate from your relationship, if indeed you have subcontractors, but also internally from a QA perspective, because you're really the gatekeeper within your agency also. What is going on? And, sometimes I tell agencies all the time when we're doing monitoring, we tell you, provide us your best files. You go pull the files, or you tell me to go pull them, I'll go pull them, but whatever it is. But you should have looked at them before we look at them. And then say, as I had to say to our state auditor recently, to Mitch, yes, I know their findings. We had these issues due to the pandemic. This is our protocols and what we put in place to address it. Yes, I'm going to be written up, but I already have my action plan and I'm already putting in my protocols to address it. Those are the kinds of things also that we've dealt with, and we get it, but we need to figure it out, and we're here to work together with it. That's why I really wanted this segment. This, I'll tell you right now, this segment wasn't anything that was on anybody's needs assessment. This segment was on DSS's agenda, because we want people to think about this, that we all have a responsibility tied to monitoring, so then we can report that we're successful. And this is about, from the larger OCS standpoint, this is about SSBG, this is about HSI, this is about CSBG, this is about SEEP. So all of these kinds of things feed into it. So if you haven't looked at, and if you haven't had the conversation with your energy folks, they get a weekly or a bi-weekly report that talks about what's going on. I will also tell you that Lynette Pisani, who's on the call, sends a listing to your counterparts in the energy department to say, these are the folks that are transitioning off of TFA. And they reach out. But what happens to those households that are, discontinuing from TFA besides someone reaching out to them with energy assistance? Are we engaging those households and look? I mean, that's low-hanging fruit also, tied from an outreach perspective. But what are we doing with that kind of stuff? Again, monitoring things that we could be thinking about to better serve our population. So I still don't see any hands up or comments in chat or anything else. I was waiting for Betty to say something to me, as usual, but I see nothing. So I guess I hit all the points.
The old sage is hanging, staying away from the tree today. I'm in a learning mode.
Okay. All right. So I don't see anything else. It's 12:51. If anyone has any comments or anything else, we are here to answer them. If not, you all have 9 minutes. Thank you.
Cassie, actually, can I just mention one thing?
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Let me just mention really quick. One of the things, and it was easier pre-COVID, but one of the things that I'm always willing to do with program supervisors at agencies is to walk through a file review with them as well. So please, if those are resources that you want, reach out to me, because that's something that I'm always able to do. And now it's actually, as long as I can translate it to Zoom, it'd probably be a little bit easier, because again, no travel time. So please feel free to reach out if that's something that you're interested in.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Thank you.
I just want to say that I think this Lunch and Learn series was really beneficial. It's one of the things that the pandemic has actually helped, the fact that we can do Zoom, because we can all get together very quickly. We don't have to travel places, et cetera, and we're able to have people participate from different levels within the agency, which I think is beneficial too. So I enjoyed it a lot. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to embarrass my boss and say she has a birthday coming up this weekend. Sonia Van Norton.
I also want to put that back on Betty, because she also has a birthday coming up too.
Well, that's later in the month.
But no,
happy birthday to you both.
To echo what Sonia says, because it's important to have this conversation with me being, frontline staff, and understanding, our agency, they were very transparent and clear, so I understand, but also another echo of bringing us all on the same table and having these conversations, and then they should really be happening more often now that we have this way to do, to put us all on the same page on understanding the requirements, stuff like that, because, I can go on, but overall, it's good to have everybody who's on different
It
levels
is.
in the same conversation.
Thank you, Eve. So Deb, I see that you're here. I know you've been here, but in case you wanted to add something else to close us out.
Sure. So we will send around an evaluation form so we can get your comments in writing. That will help us plan for the future. And you'll see on the form that we're going to ask you if you think you might be able to contribute to a future lunch and learn session. So start thinking about what expertise that you have that you might be able to share with your peers at community action agencies across Connecticut.
And also one last thing, because we've had a lot of requests, and I don't think we've officially said it, but Cassie did mention we are recording everything. So all the sessions will be sometime next week. We'll send out a link. We're going to have them on CAFCA's YouTube channel. So they will be available for those that couldn't participate as well, because we know that we've had a lot of emails this week just asking if we can share recordings, and those will be shared as well.
Who knew that we had a YouTube channel? Raise your hand if you knew.
I actually don't think, I still think we have no subscribers. So if you
Yeah, it's okay.
subscribe to it, that'd be great too. But if not, just watch.
We have a couple. We have a few.
I'll do it.
But we could use more.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And again, we look forward to seeing a lot of you in the future as we navigate this pandemic world. Okay.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Hey, thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.